So flow, piracy, and percolation in a hydropower watershed. Okay, sorry, there we go. So what I'm talking about today is comes out of work that I've been doing over the last few years in a ARC discovery project, the title of which was Do Language Boundaries Stabilize Ethnic Boundaries? And it's work that I've talked about a little bit before. I think the last talk I gave was about the work we did on houses and house construction in this area, and today I'm talking about another issue, but in the same place. So this project has been done in collaboration with my associates that you see here in this image. So Chip Zuckerman, who was a postdoc on the project and is now on another postdoc in the US. Gus Wheeler and Wei Jie Meng, who are present here today. Big shout out to you two. So PhD students on the project in the very last phases of those projects right now. So actually there's a fair bit of work's been coming out. I've just been on research leave and sort of trying to kind of wrap up some of the writing, and have had a few papers published. We've got two amazing PhD projects in progress and getting pretty close to being done. Grammatical descriptions of two of the languages in the area, and a couple of papers also under review. And I'm going to be talking about one of those today. And so the basic question that I'm interested in asking here is about the distribution of language. So it's really a kind of a geographical question, one that others have asked in relation to change in interacting communities through sort of distributed areas. So I'm thinking of, any kind of study of sociolinguistic change and historical change where you have different languages in contact. And this leads to differences in language, diversification of language, sometimes convergence of languages. And for me, it's a question of the distribution of linguistic traits, if you like, across a geographical area. So one of the starting points that I want to begin with is the idea that there's no language without transmission. So anytime you observe some fact about language, it's going to be something, a fact that's specific to a given language. It's something that is going to be the outcome of a process of transmission. So, if you record a sound, a word, an expression known by any of the people in this picture, they will have learned it somehow, and that will point to a process of transmission through generations, from place to place, and across time. So transmission is key to kind of a causal account of the process of language distribution, and transmission requires social encounters. So I'm interested in social encounters from the point of view of their causal role in spreading language through a population, across a landscape, and through time. So the view here is that every social encounter is important in its own ways, but it's also going to be a causal event in a large but finite process of language transmission, which ultimately results in the facts that we try to describe when we describe languages. And those encounters are also the sites where the kind of most important functions of language for its users are effected. So our agency, our acts of identity, and so on come about through our social encounters. So one way I like to think of it, here's a quote from Daniel Dennett, where he's writing about cultural evolution. He says, "A wagon with spoked wheels carries not only grain or freight from place to place, it carries the brilliant idea of a wagon with spoked wheels from mind to mind." So he's talking about how a piece of technology or culture has its own functions, but it also advertises itself. And I want to say that language is the same. So when you have a social encounter, these guys are having a conversation. It could be about any kind of practical matter, social matter, political matter, whatever it is that they're doing with language, they're also, as a corollary, spreading language around, right? So they're sort of carrying whatever the resources of language are from mind to mind, as it were. So this is a sort of bottom level causal engine for language distribution, and I'm interested in the forces that shape the distribution of social encounters and which in turn impact on what languages look like. So those are some of the background kind of questions, and we're looking at these questions in the project area for the project that I just mentioned. So it's this little square in kind of center of Laos. It's regarded as the southern part of Laos. It's directly east of the capital city, just inside the border with Vietnam and it's a fairly hilly country. The country looks like this. It's pretty thick forest cover. It's quite biodiverse. So it's, the area where we're working is actually a biodiversity conservation area. So it's a recognized area of biodiversity. It has tigers and other, I mean, very few now, but diverse plant and animal life in this area, which has been put under a lot of pressure, as you can imagine, recently. The human diversity is also there, so a lot of people live in this area in villages, and when I say human diversity, I mean that people speak different languages, they follow different kinds of social practices, belief systems, and they're in very intensive contact with each other and invoke their differences of identity in various kinds of ways. So they have labels for their own ethnic groups and for their own languages, and they deploy these in various intergroup kinds of ways, which we've written a little bit about. And it's an area of quite rapid development. So we're seeing, I've been working in the area for about 18 years, and I've sort of documented a lot of pretty radical changes. And the one that I'm going to be talking most about, well, I'll just get straight into that now. Yeah, it's not, the imagery, it's not great in the room now. Hopefully you can see quite well on the Zoom. So basically what you see here, there are two red dotted circles. One is very small. This is a map. I hope you can tell from Google Maps. This is a district centre. The small circle is the local district centre, small town where there's government offices and things like that. Everything sort of above and to the right is going uphill towards the border with Vietnam. And this kind of long cigar shape just adjacent to the district centre, that's a hydroelectric, that's the Hydropower dam. That's an area that's been recently flooded, displacing many villages and requiring relocation of many people, and changing the dynamic of life inside the watershed. So the big circle is what we refer to as the watershed. So it's the upland catchment area for the water that runs down into that dam. And it's an area that I just showed you images of that has the ethno-linguistic diversity we've been interested in. So here's a sort of easier to see map of that. Same place. So you've got, bottom left, you've got the Nakai district town. You've got the NT2 hydropower station. You have the reservoir there. And so the reservoir is a lake. So not long ago, it was just a plateau with villages on it. Now it's a lake. And going up from the reservoir to the top right of the image, you've just got this kind of uphill gradation with this upstream, downstream axis, and some river systems that have villages dotted along them. So I've highlighted a few of those villages with different colors that mark some of the different languages that we're interested in here. So the three languages that we've been working on in this project most closely, so Cree in green there, I've been focusing on Sak, a Northern Thai language that Wei Jian's been focusing on, and Bru, an Austroasiatic language that Gus has been focusing on. So you see other villages that aren't coloured in that way, and those villages are ones that are much more sort of mixed in the languages that are being spoken, but they're very quickly moving towards having Lao spoken as the lingua franca. So Lao is the national language of the nation. and it's the one that's used in education and in broadcasting and the kind of classic kind of sociolinguistic process of kind of homogenization through state promotion of the standard language. So Lao is encroaching, as I've written here on the screen, meaning that it is becoming the language that kids are learning, certainly in a whole number of villages, but not in all of the villages. So the villages that we're kind of focusing on are let's say, minority languages are more vital and vibrant than in those other villages that don't have that color in them. So one of the things I want to highlight here in the context of the rapid change that's happening is the relatively stable multilingualism in this area. So when I say relatively stable, obviously it's like any other place in the world, it's changing constantly and it's a dynamic kind of situation, but sort of if you zoom in, you have a situation, or at least the situation that I observed in 2004 and the first few years before the impounding of the hydropower dam. You have this relatively stable multilingualism, which means that several languages are being spoken together, and not, it's not obvious that any of them is kind of pushing out any of the other ones, and there's a high degree of kind of tolerance of multiple languages being spoken. And by this I'm also referring specifically to something that's sometimes called receptive multilingualism, so people speaking their own language when they are in the company of others. So in this particular case, so the man on the right is a Cree speaker, the man on the left is a Sac speaker. Augusta and Wei Jian here know these two guys very well. So they hang out and they speak different languages depending on the kind of situation. So sometimes the guy on the right will speak his own language, Cree, the guy on the left will follow it, but he'll speak back in his own language, Sac, and the guy on the right will follow it. So you get a lot of that. And also oftentimes there'll be a Vietnamese person there and they'll switch to Vietnamese, or there'll be a Lao person there and they'll switch to Lao. So it's quite fluid, and it's supported by a kind of an ideology of openness and tolerance of pluralism around language. And also something I won't talk about today, but we've written about, Chip Zuckerman and I have written about recently, local ideologies around language being a kind of a badge of, it's regarded as good to speak several languages, and it's good to be able to show off that you know languages of neighboring ethnic groups. But the thing I want to concentrate on today is the kind of infrastructure side of this. So I'll be talking about the hydropower dam, and that's a very kind of classic notion of, classic example of the infrastructure is a dam project, and this area that we're in is part of this massive hydropower project area. So the building of the dam, of course, is not just inserting a big chunk of concrete into a river system. There's massive impacts, and you get the distribution of those impacts from, in this case, from the hilltops of the Lao-Vietnam border all the way to the shopping malls of central Bangkok. Let me just talk you through that. So this is a before image. This is a 2004 Google Maps, Google Earth imagery of the area that we're talking about. So you can see that adjacent to the small red circle, you've got, just a river snaking down this plateau here, and lots of agriculture happening there, lots of villages there. And the large circle, people were living up in the hilltops, somewhat isolated, but still moving back and forth. I'll talk more about how that worked in a moment. But with, now in the next image, you see the effect of the dam. That entire plateau has been flooded, and that's kind of radically changed fundamentally. Well, the most important thing I'm going to concentrate on today is the mobility of people in this area. So as a sort of an aside, in terms of the hydropower project itself, so in case you're interested, so this is it was at the time the biggest it's one of the biggest projects in Laos, hydropower projects in Laos, something like $1.45 billion investment. So it's World Bank, Thai electricity company, France electricity company, and Lao government, and they are selling a lot of electricity to Thailand. So in reading up on this recently, I discovered that one shopping mall, the biggest shopping mall is in the center of Bangkok. So this one in particular called Siam Paragon, you might have visited it, its annual energy consumption is the same as several entire provinces of Thailand. So the energy is completely, the energy consumption of urban central Thailand is off the charts, and that's what's kind of, powering all of this. But I'm interested here on the impact of the people living in the project area, and it's really, the issue here is how mobility infrastructure shapes the distribution of social encounters, which in turn are the kind of engine for language distribution. So, what you see here is a dam reservoir checkpoint. So, 15 years ago, people would walk whatever direction they felt like walking. Nowadays, you have a much more channeled set of kind of travel points, and that includes things like you see here, which is it's a police checkpoint where people are required to show whatever goods they're taking in and out and that kind of thing. So there's a sort of high degree, not just of political control, which is not what I'm focusing on here, but really about funneling the mobility of people, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. So we're looking at the kind of impact of development, and I'm interested in how we can think about what that looks like from different sides, if you like. So I'm going to move away from Laos and just now talk a little bit about how some people have examined this type of process elsewhere and draw on some of the ideas that they've developed there. So these images are from an early 1960s paper by Tafe et al. On the title of the paper is Ideal Typical Sequence of Transport Development. And this is the images you see. It's about West Africa, but this section is about Ghana specifically. And each panel is represents a century, the state of play in a given century from the 15th to the 20th centuries. So what you can see in panel A is that, the inland is completely blank. So more about that in a second. Of course, it's not blank. But you see along the bottom, so this is the West African coast, so that's the Atlantic below that line. And each of these circles in panel A with a little line is a port. So that's where, goods or what have you are being brought to ports. And there are these lines that kind of supply routes to those ports. And every panel here shows how that is kind of, developing. But the question is, how is it developing? So one of the points that is brought out in that analysis is the idea of what they call hinterland piracy. And the term piracy here doesn't refer to, Pirates of the Caribbean or anything like that. It's a basic metaphor from hydrology that's about the idea that you have flow being captured. So, you have more than one channel of flow, and then when one channel of flow captures another, for example, two small watercourses and there's some erosion, and the flow of one of them gets captured into the other, that's what's called flow piracy. And in this case, they're talking about hinterland piracy, which means at a previous stage of the sequence, you have, let's say, parallel channels for mobility, and then at a certain stage later, you have more than one. Sounds like someone's got their mute off, because I can hear some sound coming out. So if you if you mute your microphone, that would be great. Thank you. So the idea is that at a step, as the infrastructure builds, then you get channels that used to be sort of in parallel getting pulled together and drawn away from other kind of parts of the structure. And that goes on. So you can see, if you just compare, for example, the first panel had all of these sort of small ports in a row, and then down, if you look at panel D, there are fewer of them. Panel E, you know, all of the flow has been kind of sucked up by these bigger ports. All right, so far so good. That's kind of the account of hinterland piracy, but of course, you'll be thinking, well, hang on a second, you know, 15th, 16th century, what are these big white spaces? You know, this is you know, a country with a geography and people. What's going on in those white spaces? Well, in the, they don't really address this very much, but in the text you get here the description: penetration lines to the interior at this former, this sort of earlier periods of the process were weakly developed, but networks of circuitous bush trails connected the small centres to their restricted hinterlands. So they're talking about, you know, transportation routes, and you've got this kind of what they call networks of circuitous trails, and that's what I want to kind of think about a little bit more now. So this process that's described here for Ghana in the 60s was also discussed by Jim Scott in his book Seeing Like a State a few decades later, and that's I guess, yeah, getting on now. That book's 25 years old, and he points out kind of basically the same process, but he focuses on sort of what is lost. So on the left, panel A in this image here is basically represents the white space in that vision of Ghana that we just saw. Where you have like a dense concentration of paths between villages where people kind of go whichever direction is where they want to go. And it's very much a ground up kind of structure of mobility. And what Scott was talking about was the state's interest in creating structures like what you see on the right-hand side, which means that to get from A to B, you no longer go directly, you have to go into the central hub. So he was talking in this case about Paris becoming the centre of France, but it's the same basic concept in any kind of you know, top-down infrastructural imposition. So the basic idea here is that when external networks penetrate, and when I say external, I mean external from the point of view of, let's say, you know, an architect of a nation like Ghana who's trying to create a, you know, a state mobility network, or someone who's building a hydropower project in Laos. From their point of view, they're getting external networks from the country to enter into this area. But of course, there are these internal networks that exist there, and they become captured and they become funneled and sucked into those kinds of new structures that are there. So I want to kind of talk you through what that looks like in a little bit more detail in the Laos case, and we're going to go back to that now. Any questions so far? No? Good. So this image here represents, you know, it's sort of, now it's a bit easier for you to look at because we've pulled away the underlying map here. What you see here is Nakai district down at the bottom left here, that's the district centre. And then it's just exact same, the placement of the villages is exactly as you saw them on the map, but the lines between them are just straight lines that make it easy. This map here is also by Gus, it says down there, yeah. So this is the way that the sort of main transportation system looked in 2004. And it's what I'm calling a kind of braided stream system. Which simply means that, kind of roughly speaking, you're in one of these villages and you need to go somewhere. You just kind of go in the direction of least resistance. And so what you can't see here, for example, you know, there on this, let's say the top right part of the image, you don't have a line directly from Gunnar to upstream Magar, and that's because of the topography. So it's very, very, these green lines are following not only the shortest route between villages, but they also tend to be following rivers, because that's going to be your kind of easiest path. So just to kind of zoom in on an example of how you know, the kind of travel that someone might want to do. In that time, I made this trip for several years in a row and talked to people and encountered people who were also making this trip. So the area where I've been doing my field work is in Magar, in the top right part of this diagram. And so if somebody needed to go from Magar to the district, which they might have to do because they're, you know, they've been asked to go by the government official, or they've got to go and pick up some, I don't know, mosquito nets are being distributed and they have to pick it up. If it doesn't get delivered, they've got to go and get it. They're going to go visit relatives or whatever. So they would have to walk. So at the time, there were only walking trails down to here. Once you get down to a certain point, there are also navigable rivers and some sort of trails for motorbikes and stuff, but people wouldn't have boats and they wouldn't have motorbikes. So you'd be talking about a 2 to 3 day walking trip between Magar and Nakai. So even if you're going to spend 1 day down there, it'd be a week-long trip. And that was pretty intrepid travel. So, you know, people are going in small groups, walking on trails like the one you see here. Depending on the time of year, it's pretty hard work. So, you know, rainy season or just periods where there's a bit of rain, you're crossing rivers like this quite a bit. But one of the things that's interesting about these journeys, and it's the same sort of modality whether you're traveling 1 hour to the next village or whether you're traveling, you know, 3 days to the district. When you're traveling like this, you're often joining with others in a party. Like you see here, you know, these people, some of these people are kind of part of a group, but others happen to be going the same direction. So you're spending time with people who you wouldn't otherwise spend time with. You're talking to them, you're exchanging, you're building relations with them by virtue of the fact that you're traveling together. You're also bumping into people along the way. So this photo is from, you know, these regular just path meetings. I'm going that direction, you're coming this direction. There's always a little kind of stop and chat, exchange a few little bits of news, and that again is a sort of a locus for, you know, language diffusion. Also, there's stopping, resting, hanging out, staying overnight, smoking, drinking tea, and all of the kind of interaction that goes with that. So there's a very, in that context of that kind of travel, it supports this very kind of robust, dense kind of interaction among different groups. So coming back to that image that you saw of the kind of braided mobility network, what you see kind of emerging, I'm now thinking of the sort of sociolinguistic work on social networks, each dotted circle here kind of points to clusters of villages that are kind of around an hour's walk apart and they're kind of connected for various reasons, common language or kind of family groups or whatever. You're going to get a lot of traffic within that circle. But also what's really important is when you're walking for more than an hour, like a few hours in each direction or 2 or 3 days, you're going to be seeing individuals who are so-called weak ties agents, so people who are cultivating more social ties across these small networks, and oftentimes they play an important role in language contact and diffusion. So there's a real kind of social network density that plays a strong role in the kind of stable multilingualism that I've been discussing before. Now that's the situation in 2004 prior to 2008. 2008 is when the dam was impounded and everyone was moved out of the plateau, not in that order. They were moved out first and then the dam. Unfortunately, a lot of the wildlife couldn't be, you know, I mean, they sounded the alarm and chased out all the animals. There were herds of elephants living on the plateau who needed to be moved, but in a lot of other wildlife. But anyway, what that meant was this bottom left half of the map that you're looking at got completely denuded. So the new structure looks like this. In 2020, now what you have is the bottom, bottom half of the image here is just a thick line running directly from Nakai district to a port village of Theun. And that is a boat. I'll show you more about the boat in a minute. That is completely changing the dynamic of how people get around in the watershed. Also because as part of the hydropower project, the trails in the watershed also have been upgraded. They're not kind of like paved roads. In fact, there was a agreement within the context of the World Bank protections of the area that there should not be roads that could carry trucks or actually even cars. So the roads they can carry motorbikes and hand tractors, which I'll show you in one sec. So this has meant that the trip that used to be a 3-day walk, with all of the implications that has from Magar in the top right down to Nakai in the top left, now can be done in about 5 hours, right? So you now can, you have to find a little bit of cash, or you have to know someone, and that brings in these other kind of collateral effects. Not everyone can do that, and most people don't travel. But a lot of people can, and what it means is that you jump on the back of someone's motorbike or hand tractor and you zoom down from Magar to Theun, and you wait in Theun and jump on a boat, and then the boat crosses the reservoir, and it's all over, pretty much by, I don't know, lunchtime or afternoon tea, shall we say. So it can be done quite quickly, and that has changed everything with respect to the kind of dynamics of language contact in this context. So motorbike travel obviously allows for the possibility of kind of stop and chat, like you see here, but a lot of the time you're just not seeing that. You're seeing people zooming past. They've got gear, they've got somewhere to go, and might wave or sort of raise their head or whatever, but you're immediately lessening the number of interactions that are happening. You're also, you still have kind of common adventure. So as you can see, people are kind of, their adventures are happening in mobility, and I think that's the important part of kind of forging social relations across the watershed. But still, it's a lot less than it was before. But what you are getting is a much greater capacity to get goods in and out of the place. So, just as an indication, this vehicle that you see in the image it's called a hand tractor, and it's basically just a big motor that runs these 2 great big fat wheels, and you can put various attachments on it, and it's used as a for ploughing fields, or it's also used if you put a trailer on it for transporting goods, as you see here. In 2004, I met people who lived right up in the watershed there were 2 of these up in the watershed, these tractors, and you'll be wondering, well, how'd they get them up there? Because those days, you had to walk. How'd you get up there? Well, they dismantled these and carried them on their backs piece by piece. So it used to be that everything you took into the watershed, you had to, one man can carry like maybe 20 kilos for that long, or maybe a bit more, but it's, you get pretty hard to carry much more than that for hour after hour on a hike. So, basically the entire village would go down, or some large proportion of men from the village would go down and bring these 2 things up. Now there's a whole bunch of them because you can drive them up into the watershed. There's a lot more boats there now. So this is from the port village of Theun, and it's where now you can see, instead of carrying, let's say, fuel or liquor or any other thing, carrying it on your back, you can now have much greater volume of such materials and put them on a boat. And then these small boats here are they're just little ferry boats that get you from the port village to the spot where the water's deep enough for this ferry to pick up all your gear. So this is the new ferry that gets you from one side of the reservoir to the other. And when you get inside it, as you can see, you're no longer carrying what's just on your back, but you're you're carrying this giant pile of stuff. But not only that, you're also interacting with a very different kind of milieu. So you've got, people like the guy on the right here, who's a Lao government official who's there on some kind of business. And if you go back to like 2007, 2008, a lot of people wouldn't make that trip. They'd be asking village people to come down. You walk down for 2 days and I'll talk to you in the district. But now with this kind of, a lot of the kind of government business is being moved into the watershed. So you have a very different dynamic with respect to outside people being present inside the watershed, and that has implications obviously for the increasing dominance of the standard language Lao in the area. All right. So what I've been kind of trying to lay out in concrete terms here is the the kind of what network piracy looks like on the ground. So you've got this old kind of braided network that is where the flow is now being captured into this higher flow, higher throughput, kind of smaller number of channels type of network. And this leads to what's technically known as percolation. It's a kind of weird word because it makes me think of making coffee, but it's not. That's not exactly what I mean. So percolation technically refers to a very simple idea, which is you have a network, and when you remove nodes and/or edges from a network, that's percolation. It comes, the term for some, it refers to this work. This is in work in physics, and there's a whole kind of subfield of physics which looks at the how percolation works. So the image you see here shows a top-down view of a forest. So this is just modeling, it's a sort of mathematical model of threshold effects, how you get sudden changes across whole networks. And that's essentially what we're looking at here in the numnoid case. So in the image here, you see a forest. Each circle is a live tree. Each black circle is a bit hard to see from where you all are, but some of them, you can see like a frontier of little black circles. Those are burning trees. So it's a forest fire being depicted here. And each adjacent tree is that's a link in the network, and the puzzle is what do I do? How do I remove trees from this network in order to stop the process of that fire? So the underlying kind of idea is to manage flow through a network by strategically targeting nodes within that. This is like sort of from a textbook on network theory. And so here you're asked to look at this network. Imagine this is a network of individuals, and the lines show the contacts between these individuals, and you get an outbreak of an infectious disease. Which one node would you remove to minimize the impact? And so you look at that and you go, okay, well, I'll probably pick one of these that has the most connections, And that is referred to as this kind of percolation process. And it's interesting, or at least it's interesting to kind of mathematically oriented people, because it leads to what I mentioned in passing just before, this idea of critical changes in systems. So critical changes meaning sudden flips from being a certain way to being another way. So from a fire burning to a fire no longer burning, or a disease spreading to no longer spreading. And what I'm talking about here is a certain pattern of diffusion or circulation of language in a geographical area to a very different kind of pattern. All right. So we want to now just summarize what I've been trying to say, and we'll kind of move to try to wrap up soon. We've been looking at how infrastructure change has been impacting language transmission, and essentially circulation, maybe is a better word than transmission, in this area. So just firstly, the old system, just to recap, this is the braided mobility infrastructure system from 15, 20 years ago, where you had paths that are kind of interlacing, a kind of rhizome structure, low flow. So, every day the number of people going on any given path is relatively low. Travel's quite slow, it's a walking pace. So, the volume of travel is low. more downtime away from a home village. And what I mean by that is, you know, when you're walking for hours, you need to rest. When you bump into people, you use that opportunity to rest. And when you rest in the company of other people that have just arrived, you talk. And that's part of the language dynamic. And fourthly, those encounters, or sometimes I refer to as interceptions. So it's an interception in the sense that, you know, I'm traveling, you come along and you kind of intercept that path, and that creates, it opens up, I mean, technically speaking, it opens up a new channel for our interaction, and we take advantage of that and have a conversation. And those interceptions and encounters are more internal to the network on balance. And sort of the new infrastructure, the percolated one, is kind of the opposite of all of those things. So the flow has been pirated and funneled and channeled. You've got a much greater flow. You've got much faster travel thanks to the motorbikes and the boats. You go further, so there's a sort of compression. You have less downtime away from your home village, so it's much easier and quicker to do business between villages and get back within the day, or to go a long way and not have like 3 rest stops along the way. So you sort of no longer having those opportunities to interact. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, when we were looking at the image of the boat, the encounters that you're having and the interceptions to your kind of interactional channels are much more external to the watershed. So you're meeting outsiders a lot more often. So as an example, you know, when I first was working in this area, it was rare to see people from outside the watershed, except for this one particular class, which was Vietnamese hikers who come to hunt or to trade. You know, so they come visit villages, and so there's a lot of Vietnamese is spoken in that area. But you didn't tend to see people from other provinces of Laos coming in. Whereas in recent years, with the new infrastructure, that you're seeing that a lot more. So you're seeing like guys coming from a neighboring province to buy buffaloes, or something like that, where they just wouldn't, that market wasn't there. So you get a completely changed dynamic. Okay. So what this all kind of means, as I've noted here, is that those changes mean that encounters are kind of, well, less cost implicating. So when you're traveling around faster and your travel mode is now no longer requiring or allowing you to have those interactions, then the kinds of reciprocity, social reciprocity that is created by those kinds of interactions begins to go away. So if I no longer need to take a break, maybe have something to eat at your place because I'm traveling slowly, you know, now I've got a motorbike, I can just zoom right past you. So there's a whole opportunity for reciprocity, a whole opportunity for sharing information, food, knowledge that is now edited out. It's pruned. It's being kind of percolated off of the network of encounters. So you can kind of localize this in some changes. They're kind of winners and losers, and depending on your view of what's good and what's bad. But just to focus on 2 quick examples. So I'm just going to contrast 2 villages and the kinds of changes that have occurred in those villages. So one village is this one, Vang Quai, just at the small circle on the right, the dotted circle on the bottom right of the screen here. That village, as you can see in the new network structure, is kind of a little appendage, right? It's stuck out on the edge. But if you look in the previous, in the old structure on the left, it's right in the middle of a sort of freeway, right? So it used to be, this is Vang Quai now, it used to be a highway stop that if you did this hike from the district center, you would arrive, you know, after like a day of walking through the forest, exhausted, you'd put your stuff down, you'd find a place to stay, get some food, you'd talk to people, you'd be there the whole night, right? So you get this whole sort of, it was a social hub at Vang Quai, and now it's just this little cul-de-sac. You have to have a particular reason to go there if you don't go there. And it's actually interesting because there are reasons, external reasons now developing. There's a as a kind of spirit medium now who's kind of set up shop there. This is her husband who, you know, and that's actually created a new reason to go to Kwai. So it's kind of interesting dynamic. We can also contrast Nam Theun, so the second little circle there. On the left side, back in the the older period, it was also kind of in the middle of a stream of travel, but it didn't require this kind of long forest walk to get to it. So it was a boat terminal, but you know, much smaller. So it's a fairly kind of average village, but maybe a bit larger than usual. But today, it's now a thriving port. It's become the entry point for the entire watershed. So the boats that come in and out from lowland Laos carrying all of their stuff, they only just drop at one place, and that's Nam Theun. So that's suddenly transported. It's massively increased in size. It's now got a secondary school and fireworks parties on New Year's Eve, and government officials come and stay there, and you know, it's completely transformed. Good. All right, so now just to kind of conclude and finish up, just to summarize, so we've seen that the creation of infrastructure that is kind of designed to link this to link this area into large-scale outside networks of the lowlands. You know, when you bring in that infrastructure, what you're doing is capturing the flow of the local internal mobility. So you get this kind of really quite radical reorganization of the mobility networks. And so with these kind of radical collateral effects on the distribution of language, you're affecting the distribution. I mean, this is what I've been trying to argue is that if you want to think causally, the way in which you're affecting the distribution of language is through affecting the distribution of social encounters. So if you think of a social encounter as something that can be spread across the population and through time, that's where the work of these changes is being done. So it means that people are now having more outsider, stranger contacts. The area is more accessible, and there's less reliance within the watershed on these internal so-called bridging network ties or weak ties kind of connections. And all of that correlates with the changes that we're now beginning to observe going pretty quickly now with the use of language. So I mentioned before that several villages are quite, you know, they're now, in a way that wasn't true 15 years ago, kids are now beginning to be primarily speaking Lao, and that would have been very strange when I first went. It wasn't observed, let's say, when I first went to the area. Good. Okay, so yeah, this is a kind of better view of the vehicle that these men carried up piece by piece on their backs, walking for 2 days. So yeah, we're kind of, I feel fortunate not to have to do that myself. So a final puzzle that I kind of just want to leave you with, that is, you know, maybe an interesting one to talk about, is the following. I started out talking about stable multilingualism and this kind of ideology of language that you can observe in the area. So in other publications, Chip Zuckman and I have talked about this language ideology that I mentioned, where, you know, people highly value knowing each other's language, that it's fun. People like to learn each other's languages on their kind of verandas when they're drinking tea. They value language, multilingual kind of competence as a badge of kind of having traveled and hung out with other groups and so forth. So you can see, observe that kind of this stable multilingualism is, you know, coheres with a kind of ideology of valuing multilingualism. And so that, you know, my view of that previous to thinking about these infrastructure questions was that, you know, just a cultural explanation, right? So this is how people happen to think about language diversity in this place. Fine, but what explains the ideology? Well, I think it's possible that you can see that ideology itself as really kind of, I don't know about being caused by, but sort of having an interaction with the braided mobility infrastructure that I've been outlining. So I've been really emphasizing how the slow travel, the braided networks, all of these kind of aspects of the previous state of the infrastructure kind of bring about all these opportunities for interactions of the kind that I've been discussing. So one way to deal with that is to adapt to it and to learn to kind of value those kinds of encounters. And now, as we see, that's all changing. So, so that's all I wanted to present. Thank you very much for your very kind attention. We've got people on Zoom, and I'd be happy to take any questions and talk about anything in the paper. Thanks.